You will not believe what happened in this quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where the loudest sound on a Saturday morning was usually the humming of lawnmowers and the chirping of sparrows on telephone wires. Yet on this particular day, something unfolded that shocked every resident watching from behind half-opened curtains, clutching their coffee mugs and whispering nervously on phones. Imagine being in your living room, flipping through channels, when suddenly you hear the screech of tires and the sharp slam of car doors, followed by the sound of heavy boots thudding against the pavement. And then, to your disbelief, a group of men dressed in what looked like police uniforms storming toward the front door of one of the houses in the cul-de-sac. They shouted commands, waving papers that looked like warrants, declaring themselves as law enforcement from the Homeowners Association Police Department, a title so bizarre that even neighbors who overheard it exchanged puzzled looks, unsure if this was some kind of prank or a real operation. They singled out one man, tall, broad-shouldered, calm as stone, a black man who had lived in that neighborhood quietly for years, and claimed they were placing him under arrest for violations that sounded more like parking disputes than criminal offenses. "You have broken the community rules, and we are authorized to take you in immediately," one of them barked, his voice too theatrical, his badge gleaming under the morning sun but hanging on a flimsy lanyard like something from a costume store. The neighbors leaned closer to their blinds, some even recording on phones, their fingers trembling, because something felt deeply off about this so-called police squad. Their cars had no official plates, their uniforms mismatched, and their demeanor more aggressive than professional. But the target of their attention, the man inside, did not flinch, did not panic, and did not beg. Instead, he slowly opened the door, his eyes scanning each of them as if he already knew their every move before they made it. He stood with a posture of unshakable authority, the kind of presence that silenced even the boldest pretender, and while the fake HOA cops puffed their chests and tightened their grips on fake holsters, they had no idea that the man they were trying to intimidate was not only far from guilty of their trumped-up charges, but in fact the most feared FBI agent in the region, a man whose name whispered in the underworld could send hardened criminals fleeing across borders. And as the confrontation began, the hook was set. How would these imposters handle the fact that their victim was actually the hunter, and that every second they wasted trying to stage an arrest was a second closer to their own downfall? The silence that followed those first few seconds felt like an invisible pressure over the neighborhood, as if even the wind had stopped to see what would unfold. And the imposters dressed as HOA police didn't realize that with every exaggerated gesture, they were digging themselves deeper into a pit they would not climb out of. One of them, a man with a shaved head and an unconvincing patch sewn onto his dark shirt, shoved forward a clipboard stacked with flimsy papers and said loudly, "You've been warned multiple times about non-compliance with community regulations, including but not limited to parking violations, unapproved renovations, and failure to submit landscaping plans for approval. You're under arrest for violations against the HOA charter." It sounded absurd. Neighbors who overheard whispered to one another, stifling nervous laughs because even in the strictest communities, nobody had ever heard of an HOA with arrest powers, let alone a squad of armed enforcers storming into someone's yard. But the man they confronted, known to them only as Marcus, the quiet professional who left for work in crisp suits and returned after long days with no fuss, remained still, his eyes narrowing as he assessed every detail of their formation. His training, years of working undercover, countless hours decoding criminal behavior, had sharpened his instincts to the point where he could smell fear hidden beneath bravado. He noticed the slight tremor in the hand of the youngest imposter, the way another's boots didn't match regulation issue, the fake stitching on the supposed badges, the wrong holster for the gun one carried, and most importantly, the lack of radios or communication gear that any real police detail would never move without. He let them play their charade longer, because sometimes letting criminals believe they had control was the best way to expose their mistakes. "You're making a mistake," Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but commanding, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. And instantly the neighbors felt the shift. Suddenly it wasn't the fake cops in charge, it was him. The leader of the impostors smirked, trying to maintain the upper hand, and sneered, "You don't get to tell us what's a mistake. You're coming with us, now." But as he reached forward, Marcus caught his wrist with a grip so fast and firm that the man's knees buckled. Gasps escaped from behind the blinds of houses nearby. Before anyone could process, Marcus twisted the arm just enough to send a message without breaking bone, released it, and stepped back with that same calculated calm, his eyes burning with unspoken authority. "You boys picked the wrong house," he said. The impostors exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly their confidence cracked like thin glass. What they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just a field agent. He was the FBI's shadow in operations nobody dared to speak about openly. The agent criminals whispered of like a ghost, a man who had dismantled cartels, infiltrated syndicates, and made international arms dealers vanish into black sites. And now, these wannabe enforcers had stepped into the lair of the predator they could never match. The tension thickened as more neighbors began recording, the hum of phones capturing history in the making, while Marcus stood unshaken, silently waiting for their next reckless move, already calculating 15 different ways to end the confrontation, before backup could arrive. The imposters were not used to silence. They thrived on intimidation, on loud orders barked at people who were too confused to resist. But Marcus's stillness, the way his eyes scanned them like laser sights, gnawed at their nerves. One of them, clearly trying to overcompensate, yanked out a pair of cheap-looking handcuffs and clinked them loudly, as if the metallic sound would restore authority to their side. "Hands behind your back," he barked, but the echo of his voice sounded hollow, bouncing off stucco walls and well-trimmed hedges without conviction. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying them as though they were specimens under glass, and said slowly, "Before you embarrass yourselves further, maybe you should tell me what jurisdiction gives a homeowners association the right to make arrests." The words landed like a hammer blow. The leader of the group faltered for a moment, then quickly snapped back. "We've got authorization from the board. That's all we need." The neighbors watching this couldn't decide whether to laugh or to call 911 because something about the performance was both comical and terrifying. Marcus, however, did not smile. He had been in rooms with terrorists who tried to bluff their way through interrogations, and he knew when a lie was patched together on the spot. He took a single step forward, and the imposters instinctively stepped back like prey reacting to a predator. "Drop the act," Marcus warned. "You're not cops. You're not HOA officials. You're criminals, and you're out of your depth." The imposters bristled, their bravado cracking further. One reached for his waistband, fingers fumbling near the grip of a pistol that looked real but wasn't regulation issue. Before he could draw, Marcus's hand moved in a blur, disarming him with such precision that the man barely realized the gun was gone until Marcus held it up between two fingers like it was nothing more than a toy. The crowd of neighbors audibly gasped, and a few even whispered, "Who is he?" under their breath. The imposters exchanged frantic glances. They came here expecting to dominate, but now they were standing in the presence of someone who radiated lethal control. Marcus dropped the pistol onto the grass, nudged it with his shoe, and said in a voice that felt like a warning from the underworld itself, "I've dealt with cartel hitmen tougher than you, so think carefully before you decide your next move." Inside his head, Marcus was already running background patterns. Why would anyone bother posing as HOA police? It was absurd on the surface, but absurdity often masked deeper schemes. This wasn't random harassment. He suspected a setup, a lure, perhaps an organized attempt to probe his identity, which meant whoever sent these clowns might already suspect who he really was. And that, more than anything, made his blood run cold, not with fear, but with anticipation. Because if his cover was blown, he would stop at nothing to smoke out the mastermind who dared send amateurs to his door. Meanwhile, the impostors whispered hurriedly among themselves, their fake authority unraveling as Marcus's real power filled the street like an invisible tide rising higher and higher. The leader of the fake squad, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, tried to regain control, his voice cracking under the weight of the spectacle unraveling before his eyes. "Listen here, you don't want to make this worse for yourself," he stammered, gesturing wildly at the others to flank. Marcus, but even his own men hesitated. They had come in thinking this would be quick, a staged arrest of some quiet man in the neighborhood, and instead they were standing before someone who dismantled their facade with a glance, stripped their confidence with a word, and humiliated their muscle with one effortless move. The neighbors, once timidly peeking, were now openly filming from porches, some even whispering updates over phone calls to friends. This was no ordinary confrontation. Something extraordinary was happening right before their eyes. Marcus noticed everything. The twitch in the scarred leader's jaw, the sweat dripping down the side of his neck, the nervous shuffle of the youngest impostor whose eyes kept darting toward escape routes. "You don't even know who you're dealing with, do you?" Marcus said, his tone low but carrying across the yard with a gravity that froze them in place. The scarred man forced a laugh, hollow and unconvincing. "Some HOA rule breaker who thinks he's tougher than the law? Yeah, we know." Marcus leaned in slightly, his presence pressing down like a weight none of them could shake off. "No, you're standing in front of the one man your employers warned you never to cross." The impostors stiffened, their eyes widening, because even though Marcus hadn't said his name, the way he said it, the certainty, the confidence, hit them like lightning. They suddenly realized they had stepped into something bigger than they were prepared for. Marcus didn't just radiate authority, he radiated danger, the kind of danger that came from decades of hunting the worst monsters society had bred. He remembered cartel raids where men with machetes and rifles screamed into the night before falling silent in his presence. Remembered hostage situations where one calm order from him saved dozens of lives. That experience poured from him now, and the impostors couldn't hold it back. The scarred leader's bravado cracked and he hissed, "Back in the car now!" But Marcus stepped between them and their escape, his tall frame blocking the path, his eyes sharp as razors. "You came to my door. You finish what you started," he said. One of the impostors muttered, "Man, we didn't sign up for this." And another cursed under his breath, realizing too late that they had been sent as pawns in a larger game. Marcus's mind whirred. Who would be desperate or foolish enough to deploy a fake police detail into his neighborhood? Was it a cartel testing if he was still active? Was it a domestic enemy trying to flush out the FBI's top asset? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. Whoever engineered this had made the gravest mistake of their lives. Because Marcus didn't forgive traps. He turned them inside out. The crowd outside grew. More neighbors were gathering quietly, their cameras recording, the weight of witnesses turning this into a stage where the impostors could no longer hide behind threats. And in the middle of it all, Marcus's calm voice cut through like steel. "You think you're hunters, but you walked into the cage of a lion." The impostors froze at those words, and for a heartbeat the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, because Marcus wasn't speaking like a man bluffing to save himself. He was speaking like someone who had already written their fate. The scarred leader's jaw twitched again, rage mixing with fear, and he snapped at one of his men to get the cuffs on him now. But the man hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Marcus, who stood like an immovable wall, and then toward the crowd of neighbors filming every moment. One by one, the impostors began realizing they had lost control of the narrative. They were no longer the ones giving commands, no longer the ones being believed because the neighbors weren't calling them officers anymore. They were whispering, fakes, scammers, criminals, their voices sharp enough to pierce the impostor's crumbling armor of authority. Marcus stepped closer, closing the distance with deliberate slowness, each stride echoing across the driveway, and his voice dropped to a growl so low it felt carved out of stone. "You're going to tell me who sent you?" The scarred man barked, "We don't answer to you!" But even as he spoke, his hand shook at his side, betraying him. Marcus's hand shot out again, faster than the eye could follow, and in a single motion he disarmed another impostor, twisting the weapon from his grip and ejecting the magazine with a flick before tossing the useless shell of the gun onto the pavement. The sound of metal hitting concrete rang out like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom, final and undeniable. Gasps erupted from the neighbors, some even cheering quietly, emboldened by the sight of their quiet neighbor dismantling armed men with the ease of swatting flies. The impostors were unraveling, their plan dissolving into panic, and Marcus could smell it. The sweat, the shallow breathing, the tremors in their hands. "This wasn't your idea," Marcus continued, his voice calm, surgical, cutting straight to the truth. "Someone put you up to this. Someone who thought sending a bunch of clowns in fake uniforms would rattle me." He took a step closer to the scarred leader, whose eyes widened with every inch. "But you've already told me more than you realize. You confirmed there's a hand behind the curtain." The scarred man tried to retort, but Marcus's stare shut him down. He leaned in, his voice low enough that only the impostors could hear, yet so sharp that it pierced them like a blade. "The people who sent you made a mistake. They should have sent an army." The impostors shuffled uneasily, their confidence reduced to ash, their voices cracking as they muttered about retreat. One even whispered, "We gotta go, man, we gotta go," like a child desperate to escape punishment. Marcus, however, wasn't finished. He wasn't about to let them scurry back into whatever shadows they crawled out from. He reached into his pocket, calmly produced a small badge, and for the first time let the sunlight glint off the unmistakable golden seal of the FBI. The neighbors gasped louder this time, phones shaking as they zoomed in on the badge, realizing that their quiet neighbor wasn't just any man. He was the most feared FBI agent in the region, a man whose reputation was the kind of story whispered in criminal circles to scare underlings into obedience. The impostors froze, their faces draining of color. They had come to intimidate, to posture as enforcers of some fabricated law, but instead they had stumbled into the crosshairs of the very man their employers likely dreaded most. And Marcus, standing tall, badge gleaming in the sunlight, looked every bit the predator they had hoped never to meet. The moment that badge flashed, the impostor's fragile performance collapsed completely, like a stage prop knocked over to reveal nothing but cardboard and glue holding it together. The scarred leader's mouth went dry, his throat working as he tried to swallow the realization that he hadn't just tried to muscle some random neighbor. He had walked into the den of a man whose very name could clear out entire criminal networks before he even arrived. Marcus didn't brandish the badge for applause. He let it hang in the air for only a second, then tucked it away again, because real power didn't need to shout. It simply existed, undeniable and absolute. "Now we're going to do this differently," Marcus said softly. But the softness carried more weight than any shout. He turned his back on them deliberately, a gesture that told everyone watching just how little he feared these impostors, and addressed the gathering neighbors. "Call the real police. Tell them to bring a squad car and a wagon for multiple suspects. Tell them the FBI will be waiting." The crowd, electrified with adrenaline, obeyed instantly, phones dialing, voices trembling with both fear and awe as they relayed the situation to emergency dispatchers. The impostors panicked, realizing the clock had started ticking. One of them blurted, "We didn't know who you were," a pathetic plea that only confirmed what Marcus already suspected. These were pawns. Desperate. Men hired by someone higher up to probe, to test, maybe even to send a message. Marcus turned back, his eyes narrowing, the air around him tightening like a vice. "That's your first truth," he said. "Now give me the second. Who sent you?" The scarred leader tried to hold on to some scrap of toughness, his lips curling in a half-snarl, but Marcus stepped closer, so close that the scarred man could see the flecks of steel in his eyes. "I've broken cartel lieutenants in less time than you've stood here," Marcus whispered, his voice carrying the weight of nightmares. "If you think you're going to walk away without talking, you're a fool." The impostor's bravado withered and beads of sweat ran down his temple. Another impostor cracked first, blurting out, "It was just a job, man. Some guy paid us to come here, said it'd be easy, said the dude in this house was a pushover." Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't reveal it, but deep inside he felt the confirmation of his suspicion. A larger hand pulling the strings, testing the waters to see if Marcus still lived in anonymity or if his cover had slipped. The scarred leader turned on the man who spoke, hissing, "Shut up!" But Marcus snapped his fingers, commanding silence like a drill sergeant on a battlefield. "No, let him talk." His tone was final, and even the scarred leader shrank. "Back." The man continued. "We don't know his name. He never gave it. Just tall, wore a hat, voice like gravel. Paid in cash. Told us to make it look official. Scare the guy who lives here." Marcus filed every detail away in his mind. He was a hunter, and even crumbs were enough to track prey. The impostors looked defeated now, like actors dragged off a stage mid-performance, stripped of costumes, exposed to an unforgiving audience. Marcus wasn't done, though. He leaned in close enough that his shadow swallowed them and said, "You've got two options. Cooperate and maybe get out of this with leniency, or keep quiet and watch the justice system grind you into dust. Which is it going to be?" There. Silence was answer enough, but Marcus could already see it in their eyes. The fear had taken root, and fear was always the beginning of truth. By the time the real authorities arrived, sirens wailing and lights flashing, the impostors were already paralyzed with the knowledge that the man they had attempted to intimidate was far more dangerous than anything they had ever faced. Marcus had them corralled near the edge of the driveway, hands raised in a mixture of defeat and terror. Their earlier bravado dissolved entirely, replaced with an instinctive understanding that their lives had just been teetering on the edge of ruin. The neighbors watched from porches and behind half-opened curtains, phones recording, hearts pounding as if they were participants in a thriller rather than bystanders to reality. The FBI badge Marcus had casually displayed moments ago was now fully recognized by the arriving agents, who nodded subtly to each other, already understanding the depth of what had just transpired. Marcus stepped aside briefly, letting the uniformed officers move in to apprehend the impostors properly, and the men in fake uniforms were now being handcuffed, read their rights, and herded into vehicles, their faces pale and eyes darting as though expecting the man in front of them to strike again, which Marcus didn't, but they couldn't shake the aura of authority radiating from him. He turned to the neighbors, voice calm, but carrying the weight of command. "No one else is in danger. You witnessed a serious threat neutralized. Remember this: appearances can deceive, and courage, when paired with training, can turn the tables on those who prey on others." The crowd murmured in awe. Some whispered questions about his identity. Others quietly expressed relief that their quiet neighbor was, in fact, a guardian operating in the shadows. As the last of the impostors were loaded into the FBI vehicles, Marcus's gaze drifted toward the street where a lone sedan waited, darkened windows and an engine running. He knew this incident was not random. It had been a test, a probe from an organization or individual who now understood that Marcus was alive, aware, and ready to strike if provoked. He stepped back into his home, closing the door gently behind him. But his mind was already running through possible leads, assessing threats, calculating responses, and preparing for the inevitable fallout. Outside, the neighbors whispered among themselves, shaken and inspired, realizing that their mundane suburban lives had intersected, however briefly, with someone capable of altering the balance of power for anyone daring enough to threaten the innocent. Marcus didn't linger on their reactions. He never did. He sat at his kitchen table, cleaned the small weapon that had been disarmed from one of the impostors, and began cataloging every detail into the secure FBI system. This was his life, danger, deception, and justice, all interwoven in a pattern only he could navigate. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood, one truth remained undeniable. The man they had tried to arrest had not only survived the test, but had turned it into a lesson in fear, authority, and precision, reminding the world and anyone foolish enough to threaten it that some predators wore the face of ordinary men, but their reach and power were anything but ordinary. The fake HOA cops had come with the intent to intimidate, but what they learned that day, and what every neighbor witnessed, was that courage, experience, and the unwavering presence of a true agent of justice could transform even the most mundane street into a theater of fear for those who would do wrong. The sun set on a neighborhood forever changed, and Marcus, the most feared FBI agent in the region, remained unseen by most, yet known by all who sought to deceive, dominate, or harm.